To say that Carol Muske-Dukes is versatile would most certainly be an understatement. Unlike most writers, she does not constrain herself to one genre. Instead, her myriad of talents cover both poetry and prose, with forays into novel writing, essays, and reviews. Her writing career began at an early age with her first story published when she was 11, and she currently has published, let's hope I get this number right, 8 books of poetry, 4 novels, and numerous essays and reviews. She writes regularly for the Huffington Post and reviews books for the New York Times Book Review and the Los Angeles Times Book Review. She is the former Poet Laureate of California, and one of her most recent collections of poetry, Sparrow, was a 2003 National Book Award finalist. Her latest book of poetry, Twin Cities, was published in 2011. It looks at the dichotomies rampant in daily life and loss, reality and fantasy, and, of course, reflects on the famous Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. One of her novels, Channeling Mark Twain, tells the story of a woman who teaches poetry in a women's detention facility. This is based on her own experiences of teaching at the women's detention facility in Rikers Island, New York. She has also worked on the Magical Poetry Blimp, a series of handbooks for teachers and students designed to encourage the writing and love of poetry through learning about it at a young age. In terms of her personal life, Ms. Muske-Dukes splits her time between New York and Los Angeles. Her daughter, Annie, is a molecular biologist who captures wonderful images of the microscopic world with the assistance of a scanning electron microscope. For those science people among us, there are images on Ms. Muske-Dukes' website, and you can go check them out there. They're awesome. And of all this, the thing that I find most impressive, she is the founder of the PhD program for creative writing and literature at the University of Southern California. As someone who's seriously considering a career in creative writing, thank you. Included in her vast collection of work is what I'm sure will become my personal favorite, Married to the Ice Pick Killer, a Poet in Hollywood. This collection of essays covers the often unexamined relationship of poetry and Hollywood. In it, she shares a number of anecdotes touching on the changing nature of poetry in both LA and the United States. Reviews say that the collection is filled with insights that are acutely observed and often devastatingly funny. This is a remarkable essay collection that is sure to entertain. I certainly look forward to reading it once I finish my English homework, that is. And with that, I invite Ms. Muske-Dukes to the podium. Thank you.
I was just thanking Eva. That was an extraordinary introduction. One that I shall never live up to, but thank you in any case for it. It was really well done. And it's so nice to have one's child mentioned. My daughter, Annie, of whom I'm very proud, and also the PhD program in literature and creative writing. For those of you who are scientists, there's a future, of course, out there. Also, I'm starting a program. Besides the PhD program in literature and creative writing, those of you who are creative writers might be interested in one or the other. I'm starting a master's program at the University of Southern California where I'm a professor in science writing. And science writing has become a really a hot new field, as they say, but a really important one. Not just popular science, but the students learn to write about actually topics that are in hard science and find a way to really, in a sense, translate them into readable prose. I'd like to thank the Department of English and the Torrey Writing Fund and Susan Consolving and all of you for inviting me. Thank you. I'm going to start by reading. Eva mentioned that I teach creative writing. And I also live in Los Angeles, and my late husband was an actor, so that's where the connection to Hollywood comes from, and that's always something to talk about too. But I teach at USC, both undergraduate and graduate students in creative writing and literature. And I was once teaching a course. Actually, this was a workshop that was not at USC. It was at a place called the Poet's House in New York City. I was teaching a master class there, and in fact, there was someone there who follows me in a sense from when I do master classes or whatever, who is a Hollywood person. She's a famous producer, but that wasn't the point here. She took this course and took this workshop with me, and we were talking about the right word, how you try to find, in poetry you're looking for it's so hard to say this, but if you can think of finding the perfect way to say something, of course that's impossible, but you try to find that distillation of intellect and emotion that creates the perfect expression. So she used a word in a poem that I thought was the wrong word. Wrong is a little harsh. It just didn't work. And she used it with a personal pronoun. In her poem, she talked about my mayhem. As if it were her own mayhem. And you all know what mayhem is, of course, right? Mayhem is chaos, but it also has a more negative spin too. It's a little darker. The mischief is darker. And after she and I discussed this, she said, I'm not going to change that word, as students so often do. So often my advice goes unappreciated. But in any case, she said, I just cannot change that word. That is, I want to say my mayhem. And she had written about being in a car with a young boy who was drunk and blah, blah, blah. Mayhem was the theme. But anyway, so I thought about that later, and I thought, when one is teaching writing, and of course it's very hard to teach writing, I'm not sure we can, but we, as the great poet Theodore Roethke said, we insinuate writing. We insinuate it. So, but through reading, you read everything you can get your hands on, you learn how to listen to the voices, you get into the conversation of literature, you learn how to write through reading, you learn how to write through writing, and so on. I thought about this whole idea of the right word, and I thought about Henry James. How many of you have read Henry James? Yay! The master. A few hands, timidly raised. Henry James, for those of you who have not read him, you're in for a great treat, because he was considered the master, right? He was the master of the perfect word, the perfect way of saying things, that exquisitely calibrated language. So I thought, Henry James would have never said my mayhem. The perfect master. I was just thinking aloud to myself. And then I remembered that Henry James, when he died, and I guess you could give him a break because he was on his deathbed, and maybe this is one of those apocryphal stories, but on his deathbed, when he was about to die, he said, at last, the distinguished thing. Well, I thought, come on, he's Henry James. He couldn't come up with something a little more exquisitely appropriate than thing. And then I realized sometimes the wrong word is the right word. So this poem that I'm going to read for you is a new poem. Actually, you're one of the first group of people to hear it. But it's a meditation on teaching writing and about the falsity of trying to, in a sense, impose the idea of a right word. Mayhem. And the epigraph is, of course, Henry James' deathbed utterance, at last, the distinguished thing. My mayhem, she wrote, as if chaos, willed, was a thing you could own. It was a poem with its title, but that doomed boy driving the Jeep, christened the thing, wasn't he mayhem, shearing corners, ratcheting up, dead banshee drunk? You're just a rider, I remind her. A pilot shifts with the wind, but your shotgun, toe steering, repo. My mayhem drove the car, she said, certain and direct from the death seat. So look, men ride differently into it. Not the girl's way, hand on his hand on the gear shift. Not the girl's way, long strands blowing, glancing sidekick at him, never straight ahead into what's coming. The windshield's panorama stops there, its painted scene forming an opinion like snow in a teacher's mouth. You could call it out, word by word, repossess what was that impossible to make happen, yet you did. Atop that cliff, the chassis shudders, begins to roll, rolling over itself into the word totaled. So the broken lilies already appearing on its grave begin to blow west under the earth, under all that revs up dyes and flowers, flowers and dyes. I made it be. So, the master, watching the snow through a bright window, refuses the vase of spotlit lilies floating to his pillow, turning away and turning toward it in his deathbed, the perfect wrong word. Yes, he says. Yes, at last, the distinguished thing. So, never let anyone tell you who teaches you creative writing. No, I'm just kidding. I was just going to say I'll stick up for your word. But, it's important to listen to think that there is a right word. And there is, of course, there are, perfect or close to perfect ways of saying things. So it's always humbling to consider that task. And yet, you have to hold out sometimes for your own vision. This is, I'm going to read a couple other new poems. This is a new poem as well. It was published a little while ago in online at a website. The Academy of American Poets has a website called Poetry Daily or something like that. And it's about a skateboarder. The Academy of American Poets has the author of the poems, write a little something about the poem. And I had to explain that it was not a skater, like a roller skater or a inline skater, but somebody on a skateboard. There was actually, I tell my students all the time, it doesn't matter what really happened, but this really happened. In Southern California, a lot of homes were foreclosed on during the terrible economic downturn, as happened in other places, and it turned out that there was a skateboarder. Skateboarders apparently like big empty spaces to skateboard in, and there were many pools that were left empty. And when people left their homes behind, and he would come in and skate inside those pools. So that's what this is about. It's called After Skate. He glides in on his single wing after the signs go up, after the truck leaves with the bunk beds, grill, broken hall mirror, after Scout is dropped off at the shelter, after the last look on the dying lawn. In the backyard where the empty pool stands open, he pops an ollie over the cracked patterns of tidal waves in neat squares. He kneels, checking angle against depth. He lifts off where the board once leapt and leapt. Cannonballs, swans, endless summer. He hurtles downward, kick-turning, sparks grinding hard on gunite. Round the bend, the kidney, the heart. The stone path where once glowed tiki torches at the kingdom's ukulele gate. He rockets out of the dead lots each day, past swing sets and shut-off sprinklers, his board struck up from whirlwind. Nobody's home to the ownerless. He turns inside their names, never minds ghosts, nothing in his wake. And since we're on kind of a dark roll here, this was a poem that I wrote. It's actually in 3 parts. I'm just going to read the first part. I wrote it a while ago about, it's about gun control. It's called Gun Control. And it turned out that it was published again online on Slate, in Slate magazine online. By sheer coincidence, though it had been accepted for publication months earlier, it was published right a day after, I think, the shootings took place here in Connecticut. And then people reacted, some of them online, saying, that I was taking advantage in a sense of that horrible tragedy, which was not the case at all. But in fact, I just, all of us, I think, have to write about what's on our minds, and this gun control had been in my mind, so I'd written about it. Not that writing is not the way to change things, I realize, but it's just, a way to think about it. I'm just going to read the first part, as I said. Gun control. When the older brother, horsing around, opened fire with the 12 gauge and shot his little brother in the back, my Aunt Anna pressed her open hand over the wound, over the blown right lung. Blood stuttered up through her fingers. As he began to slide away, she kept her hand hard, flat against that death. At emergency, they had to pry it away. He survived that night, When he takes his shirt off today at the lake, you can see the bleach white stretch where no hair grows, and the skin thins to her imprint, a handspan just under his shoulder, where a wing, if we had wings, might begin to unfurl. Oh, I'm tempted to, I'm sorry, since I'm subjecting you to my new work. I'm going to read one more, actually. I wasn't going to read this one, but since Eva brought up my daughter, Annie, I thought I would read it. It's about, well, you'll see what it's about when I read the poem, but it is based on a visit to West Point. I was invited to read my poems at West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, in 1997, I guess it was. And I brought Annie with me. I brought my daughter with me. So we got to, I got to read to the Sea of Gray, but we also got to hear a woman's voice on the plane. You know, at that point there were 18%, as the poem indicates as well, 18% women at West Point. And this is kind of it's not meant to be a anti-male or sexist poem, but hold on to your hats. It's called, I was calling it West Point 1997, but I'm calling it now A Girl's Guide to the Epic. And then the epigraph would be Arms and the Woman I Sing. We all know the famous quote, which is what? Arms and the Man I Sing. Well, anyway, from the Iliad. Okay, we stopped cold at the sound of that high voice singing out on the plain. Tin Hut! My daughter and I stood at the edge of the parade, passed by waves, the waves of shimmering gray. We couldn't see her clearly in the ranks. Later that day, I read my poems to that sea of gray. Someone called Charlie, Foxtrot, Tango, Bravo, raised his hand. Had I always hated men? Sure, I mugged. And the 18% cheered in their higher register. I mentioned gray-eyed Athena springing from a furrowed brow. Ma'am, that is a metaphor, ma'am. That really happened. Isn't that great? Ma'am, that is a metaphor, ma'am. Tangled in the rosy fingers of dawn and the wine-dark sea, her voice a lullaby, a siren solo in dreams, lotus eaters, warlords, poets, at a loss to describe the headache after she leapt out fully armed. Later still in Shakespeare studies class, heard it repeated how conscience makes cowards of us all. Ma'am, that is a metaphor, ma'am, a plebe pointed out, but not the new voice calling out orders on that ancient plain. At last we saw her alone, Foxtrot, Bravo. The wind blew up on its own out of the same old dawn, not rosy and not a metaphor. No, ma'am, no. I'm going to read a couple poems from this book, which is called Sparrow, which you've also mentioned, and these poems are almost entirely elegies for my late husband, whom I mentioned was an actor. So some of the poems, many of the poems refer to plays that he or films that he was in, but that's not usually though. That's not the point of the poems. In other words, the reference to. I wanted the poems to be meditations on the two arts of poetry and acting, and so there are places where I hope if the poems work, those two things come together. This is just a little poem about, as the title of the book is, Sparrow. You have that wonderful exhibit of birds out there, this sort of Audubon-like exhibit, which is extraordinary. This is just about finding a little bird that has fallen out of a nest. Love song. Love comes hungry to anyone's hand. I found the newborn sparrow next to the tumbled nest on the grass, bravely opening its beak. Cats circled, squirrels. I tried to set the nest right, but the wild birds had fled. The knot of pin feathers sat in my hand and spoke. Just because I've raised it by touch doesn't mean it follows. All day it pecks at the tin image of a faceless bird. It refuses to fly, though I've opened the door. What sends us to each other? He and I had a blue landscape, a village street, poems bread on a plate, Love was a camera and a doorway. Love was a script, a tin bird. Love was faceless, even when we'd memorized each other's lines. Love was hungry. Love was faceless. The sparrow sings famished in my hand. And one other poem, this is about acting. After David died, well, the poem should again explain things, but I went with a dear actor friend to scatter some of his ashes on a Broadway stage where he had been many, many times in plays. And this poem has been adopted by, do you know what Poetry Out Loud is? Poetry Out Loud is a National Endowment for the Arts project where kids learn poems by heart and recite them, and there's a national competition. This poem, for some reason, has become a kind of standby part of the, I guess, part of the, it's on the playlist, and all these, it's so odd to hear this poem, which was very difficult for me to read. I guess you'll see why. Recited by these young, beautiful voices. I've heard it recited by these young, beautiful voices. I was once a judge for one of these Poetry Out Loud competitions, and much better than I could ever do it, so bear with me. Ovation. I try to make myself afraid the way you must have been afraid, stepping out onto this stage, but with a fear so pure, so perfectly informed that you strode out shouting. Here where the neon yellow arrows painted on the floor shoot forward underfoot in blackness beneath the hanging sequence of tinted skies, out toward that mindless, immortalizing light, now dark. Now I think I feel the heat you must have felt rising from the front rows. A gaping fire door, a furnace, your single body standing here with no shadow, swinging on itself. Had you been a fool, you might have thought that they loved you. They never love you, you said. They're hungry for the god in his gold eclipse, the pure you on fire. John and I move quickly, each with a handful of ash, scattering. The sound of no sound falling into the cracks in the boards, the footlights, the first row. A small personal snow, a prince of dust, a villain of dust. Each part you played drifting up again, recomposing. I open my hand, I let you go, back into the lines you learned, back into the body and the body's beauty, back into the standing ovation, bow after bow after bow. And now I'll read a little bit from Twin Cities. I'm terrible about keeping track of time, so I'm hoping that I'm okay. Twin Cities is, as Eva also mentioned, reference to the, I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul are in many ways the inspiration for these poems. But the idea of the twin or the two or the the dyad or whatever it is, the idea of light and dark and opposites in one and yin-yang and all that are also, not to overdo the explanations, but they also connect to the poems. This is the title poem, one of the title poems. There are about 3 poems called Twin Cities. This one is about, again, it's self-explanatory, I hope, about a young woman who I went to high school with. I had, unlike you, I had nuns who taught me. They actually were not bad teachers, but they were a little narrow-minded. And actually, I started out using the real name of the person in this poem, and who's referred to in the poem, a friend of mine, young woman who was my friend in high school, who was expelled by the nuns. And this magazine, which was published, they're famous for fact-checking. It's the New Yorker. They just give you a lot of trouble, but they said you can't use her real name. She might. I would love it if I would, meet her again. I don't know if she's still around, but I had to change her name. Twin Cities. It was the river that made them two, the mills on one side, the cathedral on the other. We watched its swift currents. If we stared long enough, maybe it would stop cold and let us skate across to the other side. It never froze in place. Though I once knew a kid, a wild, funny girl, who built a raft from branches, which promptly sank a few feet out from the elbow bend off Dayton Bluff, who made it seem easy to believe. We'd tried to break into Carver's Cave, where bootleggers once hid their hot stash years after the Dakota drew their snakes and bears on the rock walls and canoed inside the caverns. We knew there were other openings in the cliffs, mirroring those same rock faces on the other shore, and below them, the caves, the subterranean pathways underlying the talk and commerce, the big-shot churches, undermining the false maidenliness of the convent school from which my friend was eventually expelled for being too smart and standing up for her own smartness. Too late, I salute you, Katie McNally. I think that the river returned then to two-sidedness, an overhung history of bottle flash and drift. I see you still, laughing as the lashed sticks sank beneath you, laughing as you did that morning when the river lifted its spring shoulders, shrugging off the winter ice, that thin, brittle mirage, making you believe we were all in this together. And this is a Los Angeles poem. The idea of Twin Cities opens out to two coasts. I'm sort of a bi-coastal creature, so this is a Los Angeles poem. There are New York poems in here too, but I'm just reading this one now. It's called Condolence Note, and I'm going to say it again, what I tell my students not to say. This really happened, but it doesn't matter. It's again a meditation poem, and it's about trying to find the right words. If you think of a condolence note, and we've all had to write notes like this, everything from thank you notes, which are sort of pro forma, bread and butter, as they say, to condolence notes having to really address the idea of losing someone, a great loss. So, condolence note, Los Angeles. The sky is desert blue like the pool, secluded. No swimmers here, no smog unless you count this twisting brush fire in the hills. Two kids sit head to head poolside, rehearsing a condolence note. Someone has died. Quotes. Not an intimate, perhaps a family friend, prompts the manners guide they consult. You shouldn't say, God never makes mistakes, she quotes, snapping her bikini top. Right, he adds, you could just say he's better off. Or, heaven was always in his future. There's always a better way to say we're sorry that he's dead, but they're back inside their music now, pages of politeness fallen between them. Oh, do not say that the unsaid drifts over us like blown smoke. A single spark erupts in wildfire. Cup your hands, blow out this wish for insight. Say, forgive me for living when you are dead. Say, pardon my need to praise without you this bright morning sky. It belongs to no one, but I offer it to you, heaven in your future, along with silent tunes from the playlist, the end time etiquette book dropped from the hand of the young sleeper. It's all we have left to share, the book of paid respects, the morning's hot blue iPod sunlit, words on a page, black border. How am I doing for time here? I can see a clock right there. You think I'd be able to figure this out? Did you? 5 more minutes.
And then people will need to go, and there'll be a Q&A.
All right. I'll read maybe just 2 more poems. This is called Boy, and it's again I'm dealing with a situation which is a little hard. It just takes a minute of explanation. I once went trout fishing in the Himalayas in Kashmir. I won't tell you how I got there. But I got there with a friend, a poet friend, a young guy who was kind of a wussy. I was actually able to hike up the mountain and go through the whitewater with the shikari. Reference to shikari here. These were the guides, like Sherpas, who take you up to fish up at Great heights. And I remembered, again, this is a fact checker situation, I remember the word in Kashmiri for big fish, it was Budagard, and I use that in the poem as well. And also a reference to the fact that I had to appear as a boy, not as a young woman. As a young woman, I would not have been allowed. The Shikari were Muslims, and they would not have been happy about that. So it's called boy. They called me boy in Kashmiri because they had no other word for what I appeared to them to be. Taller by a half foot, gawky in my rolled jeans and cap, they chose to look away from my small breasts and voice lilt and rename me in the lexicon of sex. The Shikari, mysterious, wizened, in loose turbans were our guides, up the mountain and through the wall of white water. They linked arms with us and waded us through to the high, still pools above where we'd cast for trout. They stepped in and out of Allah as we climbed, in sun and shade, singing his name. We were miles above Srinagar and 200 miles from China, and the finned bodies were swift under the surface. The Shikari pointed, Budagard, big fish. Then they murmured their one word for me, and it was not sister or daughter. I was naked face, 27, a rebel, I thought. Therefore they made me their oversight. Had they not looked away from me as they spoke, had it been otherwise, they would have heard it above the peaks, the clear, unwavering call, a command to rip my cap away, to pick up stones, to separate my face from my face, stripping the veil from a hook of air, holding it over my breath till I gasped like a fish, till I was a pair of eyes on a plate, that body the world wishes both to savor and destroy. I'm going to read one more poem. I think Susan asked me to read this and make an entire fool of myself at the end of my reading, because this is a poem called Parrot. And it refers to a lot of famous lines of poetry. I quote a lot of famous lines of poetry. Don't worry if you don't recognize them, it doesn't matter. It particularly doesn't matter because I'm going to do this in the parrot's voice, in the voice of the parrot. There's no end to humiliations the life of a poet will lead you to. Parrot. And I could do this if you want, where there's a famous line of the poem, whatever. You'd sit quietly and suddenly the parrot would shout, "Death is the mother of beauty." And then she'd nod and eat a burrito. She was taciturn, but if you pushed her, she'd become fiery and cry, "My life had stood a loaded gun," and fan her feathers. What do you have to offer that is more inventive than the parrot's glittering discourse? What do you have to say that could not be topped by, "The world is too much with us. Sunset and evening star. We real cool. They feed, they lion." Or, "Whose woods these are, I think I know." "I think I know," the parrot protests. "I honestly think I know. But I am so tired of squawking the same profound, shimmering insights and nobody listening." Thank you for listening.